Good morning, boys and girls. I hope you had a good weekend. I'm going to jump right into our lesson today. I hope you're having fun learning all about how the United States became the United States. Today's lesson is Lesson 6, George Washington, Commander in Chief. One of my favorite people to study in history. George Washington was a brave man. But really quick, I just want to look at the order of events and just as a quick reminder. First, we had the original 13 colonies that were formed. Shortly after that, we had the Boston Tea Party. Remember, it was a revolutionary idea. They were revolting against the king, who was charging taxes on the tea, but those taxes were not used to help to preserve the colonies. Then we had Paul Revere's ride, where he rode through the towns, warning them that the British were coming. And remember the signal: one if by land and two if by sea. Shortly after Paul Revere's ride, we had the writing of the Declaration of Independence. Remember, boys and girls, this was a letter intended to sway the king to let the colonies rule themselves, so they didn't have to go to war, really. And then after that, we had the formation of our first flag, the creation of our first flag, designed by who they think was Betsy Ross. Remember, the 13 original colonies are represented with 13 stars, and there are the alternating red and white stripes, 13 of them. So today's lesson, boys and girls, we're going to add George Washington to our timeline of events. I want you to listen carefully to the attached slideshow to see if you know more, to see if there's anything more you can learn about George Washington. There's actually a lot to learn about George Washington. Today's vocabulary words, too, boys and girls, are interesting because these are three words that really help to define George Washington. Daring is definitely a word to describe George Washington. Daring is an adjective. An adjective describes a noun. So this is one way they described George Washington. Daring means to be bold or courageous. George Washington was definitely bold and courageous. He was a daring man. The next word is defeat. Boys and girls, you're going to find out that they were defeated a lot. George Washington's army was defeated many times, to the point of people wanted to give up and stop fighting for the freedom that they started to fight for in the first place. Defeat is a verb. Remember, verb is an action word. It's to beat someone in a game or a battle. So George Washington had to defeat the king, the British government, in order to be its own nation. And the last word, boys and girls, is struggle. They really had to struggle for the freedom that we have. Struggle is a verb. Again, a verb is an action. Struggle means found it difficult and had to work really hard to do something. An example in a sentence is the climbers struggled up the mountain. And you can struggle, there's struggles, and then you can also add ing to struggling. All right, to make it struggling. Have fun with the lesson, boys and girls. Have a good day. See you Wednesday. George Washington's Army. You will remember that while representatives to the Second Continental Congress met and signed the Declaration of Independence, George Washington was far away from Philadelphia. He was sent north to Boston to fight the British. His was a very difficult job. Washington's army was made up mostly of farmers with no military experience at all. They had no uniforms and only old guns called muskets, which they hardly knew how to fire. There weren't enough guns and there was hardly any gunpowder. The wording of the Declaration of Independence was approved on July 4th, 1776. 5 days later, messengers carrying copies of the Declaration reached New York, where General Washington's army was camped. His army heard the words that all men were created equal and rallied in support of the independence. A statue of King George was melted down into bullets for the Continental Army. Boys and girls, how do you think the army felt when they heard this declaration? How would you have felt if you had heard this declaration? British warships in New York Harbor. The men soon realized that they would never have enough bullets for the fight ahead. It was very discouraging. Later that summer, British warships were spotted entering New York's harbor. King George had gotten help from the Germans as well. More than 30,000 trained troops arrived to fight the very unprepared colonial militia. George Washington nearly lost his army in the fierce fighting around New York and New Jersey that fall. The Redcoats chased the Continental Army south across the Delaware River. Thinking that they had scared them off, the Redcoats left only a small force to guard them on the other side of the river. It was December, and they felt sure that nobody would fight during the dead of winter. But they were wrong. What do you think the colonists did next, boys and girls? Boys and girls, you are looking at a painting of Washington crossing the Delaware River. Remember, it was a very cold December night. I want you to notice the icebergs in the water, but I also want you to notice in the background, boys and girls, the boats that are filled. You can see several boats lined up, preparing to cross the Delaware River. George Washington came up with a daring plan. On Christmas night, he gathered his men together. It was snowing and cold, but Washington had the men get into their boats and row quietly across the ice-filled river. More than 2,000 soldiers crossed the river that night. The crossings took 9 hours. Marching through the wind and the sleet of the December cold, the Continental Army reached the British troops just before dawn. While the Redcoats were sleeping, Washington's men launched a surprise attack on the enemy camp. The Redcoats were surprised all right. Some of them came out of their bunks in their underwear and just held up their hands. It was a total victory for General Washington. Nobody in his army had been killed. Washington and his army returned to Philadelphia to shouts of joy. But the war wasn't over yet. Benjamin Franklin in France. The Continental Congress knew that they needed more help in order to win the war for independence. German soldiers were fighting alongside the British. Perhaps the French would send soldiers across the ocean to help the colonists fight against the British. It was no secret that the French and British had long been enemies. The French are people who are from France, and they are also from the European continent. German people are from Germany. They also reside on the European continent. The Continental Congress decided to send some men to France to ask for their support. Their chief representative was 70-year-old Benjamin Franklin. The French did not like to lose in the battle, and they were still angry about losing to British in an earlier war. At first, they did not want to support the colonists. It was crazy to think that an army of farmers could defeat one of the greatest armies in the world, the British Army. But an American victory in New York in the fall of 1777 changed their opinion overnight. They promised gunpowder, soldiers, and ships. Valley Forge. General Washington's army was camped in Pennsylvania at a place called Valley Forge during the winter of 1777 and 1778. Snow lay on the ground when Washington and his men arrived. They pitched tents and built log cabins, but neither kept out the cold. The men were dressed in rags, and many of them had no shoes, walking barefoot in the snow. There was hardly any food, and some days the men had little to eat and drink other than bread and water. Disease spread through the camp, and many men died. The men missed their families and wanted to go home. Washington struggled to keep up his men's spirits.
Washington worked very hard to keep his men from quitting. He camped in a tent beside them for a time, earning their respect. No battles were fought at Valley Forge that winter, but the cold and hungry men spent hours training to be ready when they met the British again in the spring.